Let's begin with the Params tab. We're a little bit familiar with this tab because we've already looked at what's in Params geometry and Params primitive, as well as a few of the components inside of Params input. Let's just go over and review a bit, also highlighting some of the things that maybe we missed when we looked at it the first time. Here in Params geometry, if you recall, we have all sorts of components that allow us to draw basic geometry or to reference geometry that's already drawn in the Rhino model. Components such as point, curve, mesh, surface, and brep allow us to bring in those kinds of objects and have them become data inside of our Grasshopper definition. Other components, such as circle, for example, allow us to draw basic geometry. Here, for example, let's give that a try. Params geometry and circle. We right click, say set one circle, Grasshopper goes away, and now Rhino's asking us for a center, so we can click somewhere here, and eventually some radius. And I'll just do this graphically. Now we have a circle. You might notice that here, now I can't go back, change the radius or the center with different inputs within Grasshopper. I have to remake the whole circle again. If you want to change the different parameters, you'll do that in curve, primitive, circle. You'll use that component where you can introduce a point or a plane as well as a value for the radius of the circle and have more control. We'll get to those when we get to the curve tab. Go ahead and delete that. Over in primitive, you know that we can use these components to introduce basic data types, things like booleans, numbers, and colors. Over in the inputs, we've already seen the number slider, the panel, boolean toggle, and a few other things. Let me highlight some other components that I think are important. Here in Params input value list, we have an interesting component that acts as a drop-down menu. By default, we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Of course, all of this is editable, but let's see what we get. I'm going to go to Params input and panel, and I'll connect the two. Here, when I've chosen one, I get the number one. So I have a text representation and eventually some kind of data type representation. Here, when I select one, I pass the number one. When I select two, I pass the number two. Three, I have the value three, and eventually four. But let's see how this actually works. If we double click here, we can see how to set up these value lists. On the left, we have the text representation of the option, and on the right, we have the data that comes out. Where we have one, we have the number one. Where we have two, we have the number two. By default, this is set up so you can see some of the functionality here. You can actually also use some expressions. So here we have a mathematical expression that calculates 3. And the same with 4. We have the square root of 16, which eventually calculates 4. There's a couple of other things we can do. Let's just go ahead and output 5. And instead of having a number, we can have a text. In case of a text, you should surround it with quotations. I'll say OK. Now I have the option 5, but wait, we're not transmitting 5. We're just transmitting, well, in this case, my name, Luis. Also, you don't need to keep naming them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can name them whatever you want. Say screencast equals a video showing Grasshopper. Now we have screencast, and you get that output over there. This is useful if you want to create different settings or different options for a particular part of the definition. I use this quite a bit if I'm using certain options and switching between perhaps different kinds of treatments of a surface or different operations that I'm testing out. Another interesting component here is the graph mapper. The graph mapper allows us to input values and express them based on different functions. So if I right click here, I go to graph types. For example, I can choose conic. And you see that I have a very basic way to modify this conic curve, changing the conic function. Let's bring down a value and pass it through here. I'm going to go to params, input a number slider, and I'll put a panel there in the end. So here I enter in 0.25 and I get out 0.05 because it's been expressed with this function. As I change it, you see that the value also changes. And of course, I can choose different graph types. For example, a Bezier graph. Maybe you want to clamp a list of values so that only the highest values get expressed. Well, this could be a way to do it. We'll look at expressing different values and lists of values later on. There's a few other things that are interesting here. For example, all the components at the bottom are to bring in external data from different files. For example, the read file component is asking us for a file path, and we can eventually get that data out. So it can read things like text files or CSV files. I have prepared a small file here. It just has a couple of coordinates. So imagine this is the x, the y, and a z of a point. To bring that in, I'm going to go to params primitive file path. I'll right click on there, go to set one file path, and I'll reference this points text file, and I'll pass it to the component. Now if I plug in a panel, I see that I have that list of values. Right now, they're not being drawn as points because Grasshopper expects points to be formatted in a specific way. But I could go to params geometry and point, pass them through, and you'll see that now I get some points in my model. We'll be looking at reading data in a further chapter. Finally, here in utilities, we have a lot of very interesting stuff that is going to come later on. For example, down at the bottom, we have the Galapagos Evolutionary Solver, which is going to allow us to set up some really interesting workflows. We also have some simpler stuff, things like Scribble, which is kind of like a panel, but it doesn't have the panel background. So it can also be used to note up the definitions. So these are some notes. It's just a basic way to add some text to the canvas. As you can see, there's all sorts of stuff here in params that's quite useful. We're going to be always bringing these in, especially the input components, things like sliders, to make our definitions more interactive.